Welcome everybody to this short presentation on the basics of project management. The idea is that we're talking about predictive project management in this presentation. Predictive project management being projects that are managed by planning in detail in advance, delivering to that level of detail, and then handing over to the customer. So planning in advance, planning the detail of what will be delivered, agreeing with the customer on what will be delivered and having clear specifications. This is then worked upon through a process which says what it is that is going to happen to the inputs and how we are going to reach to acceptable outputs, which are then handed over to the customer in the form of a product, a service, a deliverable of some kind. So what is the standard of project management that we are referring to? We're talking about the basic standard of the Project Management Institute. And if we are talking about standards, we're talking about terminology that we find needs to be clarified in order to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So first of all, of course, what is a project? Right, the first definition of a project that we see here, where the key words are, of course, temporary and unique. The idea being a project is temporary in the sense that a deliverable has to be handed over, and therefore the whole work that is being done makes sense because sooner or later it is over and we have something to hand over. And unique in the sense that it is not a production process. We are not producing units that are identical to each other. This even in the case of projects that are similar to each other. We often have projects which deliver similar deliverables. However, the differences between the projects, a different place, a different legislation, different stakeholders, these are exactly the characteristics that end up defining what the project is actually about. Project management is simply doing what we have to do, doing what we can do, given our knowledge, given our skills, given the tools that we have in order to deliver the results of the project. We often also talk about programs, and programs are, as we see here, a group of related projects. Key point there being the relatedness of the projects. So projects that, because we are managing them together, we have the ability to deliver benefits being the next key word here, at the portfolio level that are helping the company, that are the portfolio level benefits that we're expecting. Just like a human being, just like most work, also projects have a life cycle. And this project life cycle simply means that in addition to having a beginning and an end, they also have phases that we can categorize and try to understand. The main ones of these phases being the ones that you see here on the screen in front of you: initiation, planning, execution, and closing. We'll see that it's not complete yet. Initiation being the processes which relate to understanding what we need to deliver and who cares about it. Planning being the processes that relate to defining how we are going to deliver the results. Execution is about doing what we said we were going to do, and closing is wrapping up the work from an administrative perspective and handing over to the customer. If we look at these different phases in the project life cycle, we notice that actually we can't have the same view over the whole process. In fact, uncertainty tends to be very high at the beginning when we still don't know exactly what we are going to deliver. We still need to define it with the customer and understand the details, and therefore it will then decrease throughout the arch of the project. While on the other hand, we have the knowledge about the project that grows and thereby decreases the uncertainty that grows throughout the project, and therefore we have clearer and clearer deliverables as we proceed throughout the project. As we have clearer deliverables, we of course have more effort, we have higher costs, we have higher investments, but at the same time, uncertainty decreases. Uncertainty decreasing, however, is not just decreasing risks, it's also decreasing degrees of freedom. And therefore, if uncertainty decreases, it is also harder and harder to deliver change, to actually introduce change. It's easier to introduce an important change at the beginning when little has been defined, rather than at the end of a project. The cost of introducing change is very high because we have no degrees of freedom left in that sense. The process groups that we were talking about can also be seen in this form, which is slightly closer to what the project management body of knowledge actually says. So our initiating processes start the project. They determine what it is that the project needs to deliver and who is going to be involved in that delivery. Then we have the actual whole process of creating the results. So first of all, the planning of the work, then the execution of the plan, and throughout the whole thing, the monitoring and controlling, which of course, when we can compare our plans to what we're executing, we realize that there are changes. Therefore, the monitoring and controlling will be obliging us to replan and to execute against the new deliverables. And this continues until we have completed the cycle of our project. We've reached the point in which we have something to hand over. And finally, the closing phase is when we can hand over to the customer and we can hand over and get acceptances. So this is the high-level overview of the process groups. Though one should never imagine the process groups as clear phases where you have a handover between one and the other. When we talk about gates and a gate structure, it's actually something quite different. It is more accurate to see these different process groups in the following way. If we chart across time the amount of effort that we put into the different activities, we can see that initiation-related effort, for example, will peak at the beginning of the project and then slowly move down, while planning-related effort, which might be lower at the beginning, will quickly pick up and peak after initiation. Execution-related effort will, of course, peak after planning. And monitoring and controlling is throughout the whole project. And, of course, closing-related work efforts will peak at the end of the project. But as you can notice, in any moment in time, we are actually working on all knowledge areas. If this is where we stand, we are executing the work that we are doing, we are monitoring that we're executing the right thing. If we realize that there's a deviation, we might have to replan. If we reach some milestones, we will archive the information about it. And if we identify new stakeholders, we might include the stakeholders in our stakeholder register. So in any moment in time, you are seamlessly jumping between the different process groups. So while certainly there is a time-related flow of these, initiation is mainly at the beginning, planning is mainly at the beginning, then closing is mainly at the end, but it's always a flow of things, and you're constantly moving throughout all process groups. So don't confuse process groups with gate phases. They are two different things. Now, the project management body of knowledge divides the activities, and this mainly up to the 6th edition of the project management body of knowledge. divides the way of working of projects between process groups, the ones we've just seen, and knowledge areas that we will see in just a second. In the 7th edition, which was launched on the 1st of August 2021, these processes that we are seeing here are mentioned as methods for predictive project management. In fact, what we are talking about here in this foundations session is predictive project management. Okay, so knowledge areas I was mentioning are in fact these. These are the key skill sets that a project manager and a project management team need to have in order to deliver a project efficiently. As you can see, there are many here that are quite self-understood. We need to know how to manage cost, how to manage scope, how to manage time, how to manage risks or stakeholders. So this is really all the skill sets that throughout the different steps in the project we need to be able to manage. So the knowledge areas. So managing knowledge areas against process groups, this helps map out all the skill sets that are necessary in a project. Now, throughout all of these, in order to reach the results that the project needs to obtain, there is a certain balancing act that the project management team need to make. And this balancing act will be balancing different areas of the project. For example, if a project halfway through the project we realize that we get additional scope, it's quite self-understood, probably to most of you, that this will mean that we need to maybe increase the schedule of the project in order to be able to complete the additional scope, or that we will need some additional budget or some additional resources. Right? Or if we don't get additional time, money, or resources, the quality will probably get impacted, right? And in general, if none of these can be accessed, then of course the overall amount of risk in a project increases. So as you can see, these 6 elements are tightly related together, and that's why we call them the competing constraints, meaning you always need to balance them against each other. Every time you look at your project plan or you look at changes to the plan, you need to balance these 6 competing constraints. So much for the big picture around what is inside the project. However, this big picture relative to the project is actually not big enough yet. Before we dive into the single aspects, it's important to notice that a project actually fits into a broader life cycle, and it's the product life cycle. In a way, the project life cycle is a little bit like a life cycle within a bigger life cycle. However, let's have a look at this with a bit more detail. And here we can see how the project life cycle, as you can see what we've just talked about it, right? The reduction of the uncertainty and ability to change and the increase of knowledge and costs throughout the project life cycle fits within a broader life cycle, which is the product life cycle. In the product life cycle, we first have an identification of a need. What is it that we need, right? And usually there is not only one way to satisfy a business need, therefore we will identify different concepts that enable us to find different alternatives to reach a solution. And by concepts, we mean concepts which will actually be the output of the project. So when we talk about product of the product life cycle, we mean the output of the project, not necessarily a product which we build and then sell to a customer. Anything that is the result of the project will be our product from this perspective. So who needs the product? What different alternatives do we have? And then finally, of course, okay, which of these alternatives are we actually going to perform? We're not going to do all of them. We will choose one or the other. And so during the concept phase, we will be building business cases, feasibility studies in order to help us during the selection phase to actually decide which one closest fits to our business objectives. So these business objectives will give the filter necessary to select the right approach. The approach which is selected will be the one that will be launched in the project lifecycle. We'll have the project charter, which defines what it is that we need to deliver. And this is the initiation phase, where we understand what is it that has been decided that we need to deliver. Finally, when we come out at the other end of the project life cycle, we close the result. We hand over the result to a customer, or if it's an internal customer, we call this production, to whoever needs to use the result, the product of the project. And hopefully this will be a very long time. If the result of our project is a new factory, then maybe because our project is about building a new factory, then the production might last 100 years, right? This new production phase. So this is the using of the result of the project life cycle. However, no matter how good our new factory is or how well made the product of our life cycle is, sooner or later all products will be retired. So this is another life cycle, a bigger life cycle around the result of our project. So essentially we say that the product scope, meaning the scope of the product life cycle, is the result that we need to deliver that will then be put into production. And the project scope is all those things that we need to do in order to deliver the product scope. So product scope, the result we need to meet in order to satisfy the needs. Project scope, all the work that we need to do. And of course, we need to learn how to move from an understanding of the product scope to an understanding of the project scope. Right? Because the product scope is what we receive from that early stage of business analysis, when we've understood the need and we've evaluated concepts and selected one, right? That's where the product scope comes from. Management tells us what the product scope is. But the project scope, this instead is what the project management team defines and defines how it is that we are going to be able to deploy the product scope. So if I need to know, for example, how much a project is going to cost or what the schedule is going to be, the product scope alone is very often not enough. We'll end up with only a very high level estimate with high error margins inside them. In order to make a budgetary estimate with a low level of error margin, I need to first define how I'm going to perform the work, right? Because there may be many different ways in which we can reach the same product scope, and each of these different approaches will have a different cost, will have a different time span. So 5 easy steps, I'm joking of course, but anyway, 5 easy steps to move from the product scope to the project scope. The first one is the project charter. Essentially, we are formalizing the content of the product scope. We are writing down what it is that management wants us to do, and the project charter authorizes the start of the project. The next easy step is the analysis of the stakeholders, understanding who cares about delivering this product scope. Who is it that is interested in the work that we are doing? If we are talking about change management, we might even refer to the guiding coalition here. Who is it that really wants the results of this work? These 2 steps, project charter and stakeholder analysis, are the initiation phase of a project. The next step, collecting the requirements, is the beginning of the planning. So essentially collecting requirements reflects going back to the stakeholders and asking them, okay, I get the big picture, but what do you actually want me to do? So drilling down into what the stakeholders actually need, both from a product perspective, so we might gain some additional knowledge on what the product needs to look like, but very often from a process perspective, meaning stakeholders will give us a better insight into how they actually want to collaborate with us throughout the project. I need a report a week. I need to know if the work is going to impact the personnel. So all these different aspects that are relative to how we're going to deliver the project rather than to what we're actually going to deliver. All these need to be added into the requirements. So once we've understood the requirements, of course, not just because someone has a requirement will they actually see it fulfilled. How often does it happen that people want the craziest stuff and they are simply not going to get it? So some of these requirements will fall in scope. Some of these requirements will fall out of scope. And it's very important to clarify this as early as possible. And this is what we call scope definition. So the scope definition is about understanding which requirements will actually make it into the scope of the project. And clarifying this as early as possible is important, and clarifying what is out of scope is at least as important as clarifying what is in scope. Once we've finally reached an agreement with our stakeholders on the scope definition, finally we can start actually breaking down the plan for the project. Breaking down this high-level understanding of what the scope is into manageable tasks that we will actually perform. That's what we call the work breakdown structure. The work breakdown structure is exactly this breakdown of the work into smaller manageable tasks. We'll see it with a little more detail later on. So these are the steps to move from an understanding of what is requested from the project, the product scope, to an understanding of how the project is going to deliver it, project scope. Product scope to project scope. Now let's have a look at the first few areas. The project charter is a document that you can find plenty of templates online for, and it defines what it is that the project is going to do. The stakeholder analysis, however, relates to trying to understand how stakeholders are going to impact the project that we are going to do. So one thing that we would like to understand relative to our stakeholders is where do they fall in the relative evaluation of their power versus their interest. Where, be careful, power relates to understanding their potential. How could they impact my project? Do they have potentially the ability to impact my project a lot, or very little potential? So it doesn't mean that they're actually using the power. If somebody has a high potential to impact the project but is not going to use it, they still have high power. Interest, on the other hand, is something similar to the probability that a stakeholder is actually going to use the power they have. The higher the interest, the higher the probability that they will try to impact the project. The lower the interest, the lower the probability. And therefore, if we have stakeholders with high interest, but also with high power, of course, these are the stakeholders that we'll be managing closely. These will be the main stakeholders of our project that we will be collaborating with, right? On the other hand, of course, stakeholders with a high amount of power but with a lower probability of actually getting involved, well, these are stakeholders that we will be aiming to keep satisfied, unless, of course, we need to take actions in order to increase their interest because we want them to be highly involved in the project. Stakeholders who have a high level of interest in the project, meaning they would like to have an impact in the project but have a relatively low power, these are stakeholders who we keep informed, or we tend to involve. This, by the way, this area of Keep Informed is an area in which we might find resources, for example, people who are interested in the project, but who don't, by themselves, have enough power to actually impact the project. And of course, we have those stakeholders who are neither powerful nor interested. And here we will be putting very little effort into managing these stakeholders. We'll be mainly monitoring that things don't shift, that things don't change amongst these different stakeholders. So as you can see, the simplest form of stakeholder analysis is simply evaluating the potential they have to create an impact and the probability that they have that they will actually use the power that they have. Once we've understood the stakeholders, of course, the next step is to understand what they want from the project, right? And that's what we call the collecting requirements phase. The collecting requirements phase starts, of course, with the same stakeholder assessment grid that we've just finished observing. And of course, we'll be collecting all our stakeholders, understanding them, and defining where they stand on the grid itself, right? We'll have all of these little boxes here represents a stakeholder, and we'll have stakeholders scattered all over the stakeholder assessment grid. However, each of these stakeholders will have requirements, and we'll be interviewing them and asking them, hey, what do you want? And they'll tell us, oh yeah, I have this requirement. And what do you want? Oh, I have this other requirement. So we're collecting requirements from the stakeholders. Of course, we'll be collecting requirements mainly from the top level stakeholders, but also from the others. So we'll be collecting requirements from all of our different stakeholders and end up with a requirements list. Right? This requirements list is crucial in order to be able to define the scope of the project. A part of this list of requirements is what is actually going to be the scope of the project, which is also what we call the project scope statement. The project scope statement is the result of the analysis of these requirements and the definition of which requirements will be in scope and which will be out of scope. And with this, we can then create what is known as the scope baseline. The scope baseline is created by the scope statement that we've just talked about, but first of all, by the breakdown of that scope statement, the work breakdown structure. Right? The work breakdown structure is essentially a breakdown of the activities that we will be performing, and we'll see a few examples of WBS shortly. If we take the lowest most level of the work breakdown structure, which by the way are called work packages, and we define each of those work packages, we create what is known as the work breakdown structure dictionary. Right? The dictionary is essentially a description of the work packages. And of course, together with the project scope statement, these three documents create the scope baseline once it's approved, once all three are approved. However, let's have a look, a little bit at least, at what the work breakdown structures look like and what type of work breakdown structures might exist. Right? For example, here you have a work breakdown structure, and as you can see, the first step is the breaking down of the top level, right? High-level categories of work that is going to be done. Each of these high-level categories is then broken down into smaller steps, and each of these smaller steps in actual packages of work that can be measured, can be costed, can be scheduled. We can define the resources for them. So remember, down here at the work package level is where work actually happens. Everything else above the work package level is nothing but an aggregate of the stuff below it. It's only at the work package level that we have real resources allocated, that we have costs, that we have time, that we have skill sets, and so on. Everything else is just an aggregate of everything below. So, of course, the topmost level will be an aggregate of the whole project. Right? So how can we build this first top level? Well, there are different approaches, right? First of all, there is no wrong approach. It depends on your project. However, there are some approaches which are more common than others. This one, for example, as you can notice, is life cycle based, right? We create the first level here, starting with what happens at the beginning, then what happens next, and finally the end of the project. This is a very common way of representing a first level of a work breakdown structure, but it is certainly not the only way. Right? Now, once you've reached the work package level, however, that is not necessarily the level in which you plan the project. So if you have a work breakdown structure looking like this one has only these two levels here, and the work package level can then be broken down into sub-activities, right? Where we can say, for example, equipment delivery activity can be broken down into these three sub-activities. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, why are these not the work package then, right? And the idea is that the work package level is the level at which you can control the project. So the work package level is the level at which the project management team is interested in controlling the project. So the levels below are levels that are interesting for the owner of the work package. It might even be a sub-project, but they are not going to be managed specifically by the project manager. They are managed by the owner of the work package. The project manager is interested in controlling at this level here, at the work package level. That's why the work package level is the end of the work breakdown structure, and what we have below it are the activities. However, the planning of the work, which is done by the owners of the work packages, might be done at the activity level because it offers more flexibility and it offers more accuracy. So you may go through understanding the activities behind all of the work packages, right? And putting them together in what is known as the activity list. Right? And this activity list is often where the lowest level of the planning actually occurs, with a strong involvement from the owners of the work packages. And of course, once we have the definition of the work that is actually going to happen, now comes the whole planning phase, which starts with the work breakdown structure. But now we need to dive into it and define how long will each of these activities take? How much will each of these activities cost? Which one will come first? Which one will come next? Putting it all together into a project management plan. Right? As you can see, predictive project management is strongly plan driven. Therefore, the work done in building the plan is very important. Defining the order of the activities, of course, is very important. Once we've defined the activities, we'll be defining what type of dependencies exist between the activities. So, for example, if I can perform an activity after an activity has finished, this is a finish to start dependency. I can only start the second activity after the first one is complete. Right? I can also have other types of dependencies, for example, start to start, where the second activity can only start after the first one has started, or finish to finish, the second activity can only finish after the first one has finished. And there are many cases in which you have both of these at the same time. Right? I invite you to think about cases, right? Imagine cases in your own projects in which you have finish to start or finish to finish activities. Start to finish activities are a little bit more rare, a little bit harder to encounter, but they are, of course, also important to identify if they do encounter. And essentially it means that because another activity is starting, because the second activity is starting, the first one needs to end. right? So, for example, if I'm launching a new product and I end support on an old product, right? The moment I launch a new product, that will trigger the end of the support work for the older version of that product. And of course, if the new product is launched late, well, the support for the older version will continue, right? But it's the beginning of the launch of the new product which starts the end of the maintenance or the support for the old product. An easy example for this is if you imagine that you are selling tickets at the entrance of a theater, and the moment the show starts, they will shut the doors because nobody's allowed in anymore in order not to disturb the show. So the moment the show starts, they shut the doors of the theater, and therefore your activity of selling the tickets, the first one, needs to end, right? You are selling tickets until when? Until when the show starts and they shut the doors. If they start the show 20 minutes late, you can sell tickets for 20 minutes longer, right? So these are start to finish dependencies, relatively rare, but fun. Anyway, all of these different dependency types can be either mandatory, meaning I have to do them, it's physically mandatory, or discretionary, meaning there's a process that says that's how I should do them, right? It reduces risks if we do it in a certain way. It increases quality if we do things in a certain order. And all of these, of course, can be cut. A discretionary dependency can be cut. We'll see this is what we call fast tracking. And, of course, cutting fast tracking introduces additional risks or maybe additional costs. You can also have external and internal dependencies, meaning an internal dependency is a dependency between two parties that are internal to your project. You have some level of control over them. External dependencies instead mean that the dependency is from an external party. A customer needs to finish the civil works before you can come and install your equipment. A vendor needs to deliver a server before you can go back and integrate it into your network. So external dependencies are typically fraught with risks. So if you're doing your risk analysis, analyzing external dependencies, usually a very good idea. And of course, dependencies have a couple of other characteristics. A lag, for example, is a certain amount of time that you need to wait before you can start the next activity, right? Imagine you poured the concrete and now you have to wait for it to cure before you can install a pole on it. Or a lead is the other way around. You finish an activity, then you can start the next one, but hey, there's a bit of paperwork and some administrative stuff that you can do in advance and save a few hours or a few days. That's a lead. So a lag and a lead are useful in order to fine-tune your schedules. And let's have a look at the different schedules. First of all, of course, the high-level schedule, where we have the key milestones, right, that need to meet our stakeholders' deadlines, for example, right, where we track at a high level and we report at a high level where we stand. This is called a milestone chart, and it's typically what we offer towards higher level management, towards the customer. We typically don't want to go there with too much detail. Milestone chart that gives the big picture, and then you can drill down where there are questions. The second level, of course, is the project level. Where is it that the project manager's overview needs to spread? And this is typically a bar chart, also known as a Gantt chart. The third level is the activities level, where the various owners of the work packages need to be involved into understanding what happens next, right? So if I own activity H, for example, I want to know that both G and E are inputs, and I will need to make sure that I'm keeping an eye on them, and so on and so on. This is called a precedence network diagram, right? These three scheduling techniques obviously need to fit together. right? I will want my network diagram to feed into my Gantt chart, which will need to feed into my milestone chart. And ideally, you're using some kind of software that does this in automatic. Otherwise, it's a nuisance and a bit of manual work to do. But it's important that all these scheduling models or scheduling approaches relate to each other and are saying the same thing. Once the schedule is complete, we can move towards the costing, right? Where we're asking ourselves, okay, what is the cost of the single activities and how do they aggregate together into the work packages that we're working on, right? In order to understand how all of it aggregates together into the project. Let's have a quick look at that. So if, for example, we're observing the activities in a bar chart, these are the activities of my project, we can, for example, identify, first of all, given the estimation of the duration of the activities plus the estimation of the dependencies, we can estimate how long the project is going to last. And then if we estimate how much each of these activities is going to cost and we aggregate them, we can of course track what is a cost baseline and aggregate all the costs throughout time. As you can see here, scope in the sense of the activities that we're doing, schedule in the sense of the Gantt chart, and cost in the sense of the cost baseline, they all depend together. If I add an activity here, I will end up pushing something out, I will end up increasing the costs. Remember the competing constraints? This is exactly what we were talking about, right? Okay, so much for the big picture. Now it's time to look into a little bit about what can go wrong. What is it that can slip in projects? So the next step is what we call risk management. We'll be looking at what risk management is all about. So here we have the first definition. The risk, by the way, all these definitions are taken from the PMBOK glossary. So a risk, an uncertain event or condition that if it occurs has a positive or negative effect on one or more project objectives. So first of all, of course, it's important that we're looking at risks which impact our project objectives. That's what we care about. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. There's a lot of things that could go right or could go wrong. What we are looking at from a project perspective are those risks which impact the project objectives. Of course, we are looking at uncertain events, right? We're not looking at any event, we're looking at those that are uncertain in order to talk about risks. And there's an interesting aspect here. This uncertain event, which will impact the project objectives, can have either a negative effect or a positive effect on the risks. And this is something that is good if you start getting used to. Risks are both threats and opportunities. So when we talk about risk management, we talk about managing both threats and opportunities. And the reason for which we manage them together is because both are dealing with uncertainty. In both cases, what we are actually looking at is the underlying uncertainty, and we're trying to reduce that underlying uncertainty. Of course, in the case of a threat, we're trying to bring it to zero. In the case of 0% probability of occurring. In the case of an opportunity, we're trying to increase it to 100% probability of occurring. But in both cases, both if we try to eliminate the threat or we try to make the opportunity materialize, in both cases our effort is the reduction of uncertainty. That's why we manage them together. So let's have a look at what this cycle is actually about, what the risk management cycle is actually about. Well, we've already seen that all of these risk events that we're managing relate to the project objectives, right? So we're trying to identify those events that can impact our project objectives. This is what we call risk identification, right? And once we've understood which are the events that we're trying to identify, we will analyze them. We'll try to understand them a little better. We'll be trying to analyze them from the perspective of what is the probability, what is the impact, what are the root causes, who can affect them. All this is qualitative analysis, and we might even use models and statistics and simulations in order to understand the context around the risk, right? That's quantitative analysis. In most projects, we only do qualitative analysis, but in some cases, you might also end up doing quantitative analysis. In any case, qualitative or quantitative analysis are simply about understanding the risk and the context better so that we can then manage them more appropriately. And that is in fact the next step, defining what are we going to do about these risks, right? The response planning. Once we've defined, are we going to mitigate a risk? Are we going to enhance an opportunity? We will be then tracking what it is that we've decided to do in order to make sure that we are actually getting there. And of course, we'll also be observing the context to see if any new risks materialize. So in one way, you could look at it this way. Identify risks answers the question, what could impact my project objectives? Then the analysis answers the question, which of all of these risks are important and which ones are less important? Response planning answers the question, okay, so what are we going to do about them? How are we going to deal with them? And monitoring and controlling of risks answers actually two questions. First of all, did our actions work? And secondly, are there any new risks in the context that I should be worried about? So let's have a quick look at the qualitative analysis part and looking at the probability impact. In particular, I'd like to show you this way of rationalizing probability and impact, which is also useful if you get used to. It's essentially once you've evaluated each single risk, and for each risk that you've identified, you've evaluated the probability that it might occur, and you've evaluated the impact that it would have if it were to occur. And you can, of course, then track it on a matrix like this, where you might have low-level risks at the bottom with low probability and or low impact. You might have medium-level risks, right, which are a little bit higher probability or a little bit higher impact, and those of course may be more and more. And of course you might have the high level risks that you want to pay attention to, and those might have a high probability and or a high impact. Usually we are more worried about risks that have a higher impact than the risks that have a higher probability. Of course, if they have both a high, those are the ones that we're most worried about. But if we need to choose between a risk that has a high impact and a low probability, and a risk that has a high probability but a low impact, we'll be much more worried about the high impact part. So, defining the risks, understanding which ones are important, which ones are less important, and then, of course, response planning, deciding what are we going to do about the risks. As we said, risks can be both threats and opportunities. And we certainly are not going to be doing the same thing both for threats or opportunities. In the case of threats, for example, we might decide to transfer a risk, either to a vendor, for example. A vendor that might be more able to deal with a risk than we are because maybe they are more accustomed to it. Or we might decide to share an opportunity with a vendor, right? Because together we have a bigger chance of getting the business or leveraging the opportunity. So transferring threats, sharing opportunities are two approaches. If we cannot transfer them or hand them over, we might mitigate a risk, meaning we try to reduce the risk. For example, by reducing the probability that that risk might occur. Mitigate is about reducing that threat. And reducing the probability of a risk is a mitigation response. Of course, we might be mitigating a risk, but we're not able to bring it all the way to zero. We are only able to reduce the risk. Therefore, every time we mitigate a risk, we always have what is called a residual risk. In case we have an opportunity, of course, we won't be trying to mitigate it, we'll be trying to enhance it. Right? And if we bring these to the extreme, we have either avoiding a risk, it's not going to happen. Typically, we avoid risks by eliminating the root causes of the risks. Or we exploit an opportunity, we make it materialize. Right? So these in both cases have eliminated the uncertainty. In both the cases of threats or opportunities, we might decide not to do anything before the risk materializes, and that is called acceptance. So we decide that we'll wait and see. Right? Maybe this threat will materialize, maybe it won't. I'm not going to do anything beforehand. The same thing with an opportunity. If it materializes, I'll take advantage of it, but if it doesn't, I'm not going to do anything to enhance it. And of course, another approach that will be used both for threats and for opportunities is the possibility of escalation. Right? If there's something that does not compete to your project but can be better dealt with at a higher level, you might be able to escalate it. And this is both for threats and for opportunities. So how does uncertainty impact our competing constraints? And in particular, how does it impact, as we saw, the schedule and the costs? Well, imagine that we identify a lot of risks, and we identify that there are risks across the different schedule that might end up pushing my project out by a certain amount of time. Right? This amount of time that we've estimated, we can take in consideration, for example, by adding a buffer. Right? This that you see here at the end of the project is called a project buffer. Right? There are also other types of buffers, feeder buffers, resource buffers, but in any case, for the moment, we're interested in this project buffer, right? Meaning at the end of the project, an amount of time of delay. Therefore, we'll be committing with our customer for this date, not for this date, right? We include the buffer into our project. These additional activities that we need to perform in order to manage our risks, of course, don't only take time, they also might have additional costs, which introduces reserves, contingency reserves in particular. Contingency reserves relate to money that is actually project money. So the project team can actually decide on how to use that money. There are also other reserves, such as management reserves, which on the other hand are not project money and come on top of the contingency reserves. So much from a risk management perspective for the fundamentals session. Of course, as you proceed, you'll be comparing if what is happening in reality is aligned with what you had in your plan. For example, this is how long we were expecting things to take. Is this how long it's actually taking, or is this activity actually taking longer? This is how much we expect it to have in costs. Is that what's happening, or are our costs escalating out of control? This is what we call monitoring and controlling, where monitoring relates to the collecting of the data and controlling relates to the actual evaluation of the variances and defining the corrective actions. So what is monitoring and controlling? What is the essence of monitoring and controlling? Well, honestly, you've guessed it probably. It's about variance. It's about comparing what you have in your plan against what is happening in reality. Comparing actuals against the plan, and of course deciding what to do about it. So this comparison, the measurement of this variance, is the essence of monitoring and controlling. And what else is there in monitoring and controlling? Well, as we've said, right, comparing the actual to the planned, but also understanding what it is that we're going to do, what corrective actions are we going to take. And of course, if there are risks that we see in the future and we want to act before they materialize, monitoring and controlling is also about defining what preventive actions we can take, right? Of course, monitoring and controlling is also about always understanding what is happening and sharing this understanding with the rest of the organization, right? Therefore, creating new action plans, replanning, following up on what has happened, right? And observing whether or not what we've done has actually helped, has actually been useful for the project. And finally, if we do notice that there are deviations while we are working, we need to decide how to act on these deviations. And these deviations can be of many different types, right? We can have minor delays, we can have big delays, and minor delays might be dealt with, for example, by adding some overtime. This is what we call, this is one simple way of doing crashing, right? Increasing the resources simply by adding overtime of the people who are already on the team. Of course, if your team is working overtime anyway, well, you've lost this opportunity that you have with a little bit of flexibility that it included in it, right? Fast tracking relates to the cutting of the discretionary dependencies. We talked about them earlier, right? Essentially, we put activities in parallel in order to bring the project in. If the delays are a little bit bigger, of course, we might need to crash more seriously, bringing in additional resources from the outside, more expensive, and of course, might impact the project in many ways. If the delays are even bigger than that, you might reach a point in which you actually have to reduce the scope of the project. And in some cases, there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it, and all you can do is accept the change and therefore adjust the baseline if you end up paying penalties, right? So as you can see, there's a graduation in there's a degree of reaction that you take depending on the size of the delay or of the cost impact with regards to what action you decide to take. Finally, if you succeed in reaching the objectives of your project and you deliver what your project was about, the final phase of the project is the closing phase. The closing phase is composed of several different steps, of different actions. The first, probably most important element of the closing phase is handover. Handover can be just a checklist that is filled in, or it can be a 1 year work of handing over a new product line to the factory, and there's all sorts of startup activities that goes on with it, right? So handover can be very simple or can be very complex, but in any case, it's handover. It might happen in one occasion, or it might happen in multiple occasions, with different things checked in different moments in time. But in any case, in both, whether it's simple or it's complicated, it's about handing over the results of the project, getting them accepted by the customer, and handing over responsibility to the customer. And of course, this can only happen if we have gained acceptance of the result that we need to meet, right? And this acceptance, again, can be very formal, can be informal, depends on the type of product that we are delivering. In most cases, we will have some administration-related aspects to deal with, right? Wrapping up the feedback, wrapping up the documentation, wrapping up the lessons learned documentation, and all the different aspects, the reports from the project. All this is administrative closure. There might also be legal aspects that need to be closed, contracts with vendors that need to be closed. All these are administrative closure related aspects. Some of these will be particularly important and they relate to financial closure, right? This might be simply Have we paid the vendors for what they've done? Have we clarified what outstanding payments there are? Have we invoiced the customer for everything that has been accepted by the customer? But it is also, did we close the accounts that we had opened for this project, right? So financial closure. Lessons learned will not surprise you. What can we do better next time? What did we learn in this project that will change the way we work in the future? Right? And of course, releasing the resources, right? Handing over the resources back to the functional lines. So, my friends, thank you very much. I hope that you've enjoyed this short 1-hour overview of what project management is. And I hope that it can form a little basis for you to decide how to proceed in the future with learning more about project management. This was about predictive approaches to project management. Of course, there are also other approaches, such as agile approaches to project management, that were not addressed in this video. Thank you very much. I wish you all the best, and goodbye.